Welcome back to this panel discussion. As you heard, we had to wait for the virtual audience to join us. So these are new things we still have to adapt to. The virtual audience had the opportunity to listen to an interview with Elizabeth Andre. Well, but now we will talk about AI in politics and how AI can foster democracy and where it doesn't. We will talk about this with Anke Domscheit-Berg, member of the Bundestag for the political party The Left. Welcome, as well as Jeanette Hoffmann, political scientist and professor of internet politics at Freie Universität Berlin. Welcome. Over the festival, we've learned a lot about how machine learning and AI actually work, and Professor Andre showed us in detail how these systems are being trained. We now know that AI can recognize patterns, and for politics, we now need to ask ourselves, couldn't AI make the best decisions because it seems to be objective? I know we've learned that there is bias in AI as well, but provided that we have a question regarding different relationships, interconnections, wouldn't that be handy for society, or is that a utopian idea? So could AI help politics make decisions for our society? And I would like to know about your point of view. In my opinion, this vision is the vision of a technocrat, the idea of calculating the optimum solution for politicians to implement. Let me explain that the fundamental idea of democracies is based on discussing different solutions in an open, transparent context, because the best solution is not obvious. We need to know for whom, under which circumstances. So you need to know about different aspects that go into your decision. And usually we have a public debate in order to determine that. Our democracies really depend on a pluralistic society where different points of views are being brought into the debate and people can actually get into a discussion with each other. And so when a decision is made, even if we were not part of that, we know how it was made and what the consequences would be of that decisions, which aspects we didn't consider, and which criteria were the most critical criteria that we used. And if we use an AI-based system, that wouldn't be the case. Well, there is research on explainable AI, provided that AI was able to explain the decisions and define the negative consequences for certain groups. Would you prefer that result? That is not the question. I'm not talking about transparency or the question whether we can explain or retrace how an AI-based system obtained a certain prediction or a solution. I'm sure we will be able to do that one day. The question is rather that we need to understand that AI-based systems are about optimization. And when we talk about democracy, then this is about forming your own opinion and trying to consider different opinions and perspectives. So that is a completely different mode of making a decision. And we need to understand that these two systems operate on an entirely different basis with a different aim. Democracy aims at finding a solution that can be supported by the majority of society. Let's think about climate change, for example. We know that even if we were all in favor of stopping climate change, we still have different objectives and are willing to pay different costs or accept different consequences. Some are in favor of slowing the process down so that different industries can cope with structural change. Would that be considered in an AI-based system? And who is responsible for making that decision? For our democracies, we know that elections and the public debate rely on the participation of everyone. And I do not try to romanticize that. I know many people, or some people, think that democracy is not the best way of mitigating climate change. These short-term solutions of politicians, the influence of lobbyists. Many people think that an AI-based system would be more affected, but it wouldn't be democratic at all. Well, I believe that AI today is not able to make such complex decisions, and I do not believe that this is not based, or our politics today are not based on facts, for example, especially in terms of climate change. I think we've gone beyond facts in this regard. And if we considered the available data input, that would be great. The last US presidential election used a platform AI for president, and there was fake advertisement claiming that any AI would be better than Trump and that decisions should be made based on AI. However, AI systems today are highly specialized, able to solve a single task, and that is not true for politics at all. Politicians need to take many different interests and point of views and aspects into consideration. So I think it would be great if we had a higher quality regarding the input variables for our politicians, which is not true in terms of climate change. We know diesel is not a good idea, but still we use it. And in my opinion, we should use some principles from this real world and transfer this to AI-based systems, or make the legislation process more transparent, because it still is a black box. But the main question is, how free can AI-based democracies be? And that is interesting in my point of view. I ask myself, what is an AI-based democracy? This does not only refer to the president or the chancellor making autonomous decisions. We can also define AI in a way that says it is a society in which we are already living, in which AI-based processes influence our decisions. And that brings us to different Facebook aspects. And for example, if Facebook decided to show the I'm going to vote button for one political party and not for all of them, then this will be a way of influencing the behavior of voters. So politics is not only about laws, but also about administrative processes, different forms that need to be filled out in order to receive welfare, for example, many administrative processes, CCTV cameras at the Südkreuz station in Berlin, and many other processes. And we still lack an evidence-based observation about these procedures. Many security-related laws are being passed by our Minister for the Interior, Mr. Seehofer, and this is not fact-based at all. This is a very specific way of looking at our security policy. And when we talk about AI, then we need to weigh up some things against other things. When it comes to fundamental rights and affecting them. And I know in terms of COVID-19, this is an entirely different matter, but when it comes to facial recognition, we need to know what the benefit is. We need to identify a mechanism that makes it possible to evaluate the application of AI. That's a fascinating question, especially when you talk about I vote buttons at Facebook, because Facebook claimed to have strengthened democracy, but you are pointing out that it is difficult to see whether that is actually true, because Facebook does not disclose data, not even for researchers. So it is hard to know whether they are telling the truth. Are there positive ways for AI to have a positive impact on our democracies? I would like to contradict some of the things you said, talking about climate change, for example, different ways of modeling climate change developments in future. For example, our economic actions, these predictions are based on AI. Yes, but they do not lead to the fact that we're phasing out of coal earlier than planned. That's a different question, but I'm saying that AI is already being used for that, and when it comes to predictions, then AI is already an integral part. I presume that on a long term, the knowledge about predictions will have an impact on our democracy to the extent that the responsibility of politicians will change in terms of the duration or the period of time. For example, that people are being made responsible or held accountable for things that happened in future. There's an interesting story I'd like to share. There was an earthquake in Italy, and researchers were accused of not having known things they should have known, which is that the probability for an earthquake was increasing for a certain region. So I wouldn't be surprised if this would be a phenomenon that would also affect politics, that this short-term perspective for action that is only about one term of office, that this would change. And we know that information on forecasts and prediction can have an influence on how we assess the performance of our politicians. Well, that would be a dream of mine, but I'm afraid that that will not be the case. And if you look at news presenters and news shows from the 1980s, we know that the things they have predicted have actually come true. So why should we take that into consideration in future if we haven't done that in the past? In my opinion, that is simply the human aspect that comes into the equation. Maybe you're right, but I do not believe that this could be the case. In fact, there are many positive aspects about AI. For example, some countries use AI in order to expose illegal police violence within their own ranks. These are major exceptions, of course, because usually governments use AI in order to expose criminals. For example, tax avoidance that was exposed due to the analysis of patterns in tax data. That is, for example, true for the Panama Papers. So I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but it increases the acceptance for AI if we use AI to expose failures within the system, or, for example, to make different entitlements for different social classes, for example, disadvantaged families, more accessible. Some families that are entitled to social welfare do not get that because they do not know that they're entitled to receive it, or the forms that they need to fill out are hard to understand. Sometimes they do not have sufficient language skills. Sometimes they're afraid of going to certain authorities. And if you use a messenger chatbot that understands plain language, then I can use that in order to ask my questions. And I tried to do that for a refugee that was aimed at, for a chatbot that was aimed at refugees. And if this was a chatbot, I would have asked the chatbot, what are you talking about? What is Hart's fear? And then the chatbot would have explained, well, this is a social welfare system in Germany, etc. So I think chatbots using plain language, different languages, 24/7 can really help people use social welfare in Germany. But what is important is who designs the algorithm, who is responsible for that. An authority, for example, with the hidden target of trying to refuse as many applicants as possible? Or is it rather an external stakeholder, maybe a social federation or a cooperation between the two? So we need to pay attention to these details, to the intention behind these algorithms, how they're being trained, how we can review them. But I do see that there is potential. Maybe the AI could even calculate which answers would lead to a positive decision. Well, that is something a student of law has already invented in the United Kingdom. He came up with a contradictory chatbot for receiving penalties in traffic, and they used it based on the chatbot, and he actually got information from the London authorities in order to establish a better databases to optimize these contradictions. And he considered all the different contradictions over the last years, and the chatbot asked the right questions. For example, was there snow? And if you said yes, then there was an example of a decision taken by the court that said due to snow, this or that penalty was not legitimate, and they were able to use that. And he developed something similar for people that were threatened or that were about to be homeless, and he tried to help them. He actually even used lawyers to support the system. And well, the aid offered by the state was very slow and couldn't really prevent people from becoming homeless. And the chatbot he developed was fast and really helped people. And the chatbot actually used questions that made it very likely for them to get these the welfare support. And in my opinion, that is the best way of using AI.
So the floor is now open for discussion. There is a mic, and an usher will bring a mic to you, or rather you can go to the mics in the hall. The online audience can also ask questions. There is somebody looking after that. Apparently no questions online as yet. So think about questions. I've got some more questions. Jeanette, I thought it was exciting. People can be under pressure if AI can predict better and better. Well, if the decision is such, it will have this impact or that. Anke, you said this will not change anything. But if this escalates, and for every decision it turns out, well, if you do this, then this will happen, what would have to change? Which data are used? Too little. So do you see ways out of this short-term mindset? This is a great chance. Answer. this development has two sides. It's rather ambiguous. We see a big growth, a huge growth in data, and with that there is a belief in data, there is a blind belief in data. We think they are objective, when you should be skeptical rather. But if it goes on like this, that data we have, that we ascribe predictive qualities to them, then the status of models about future developments will have more weight than the statement in '83 when somebody said, if we continue like this, the atmosphere will heat up in a certain way. Then the weight of such statements will become bigger and more important, and then you would think that the power of such models needs more justification than has been the case so far. Otherwise, I think you are right, Anke. Everything that has happened over the last 10, 20 years in fields where we are active, for instance, broadband telephony, well, there have been lots of promises over the last 20 years. None of those promises have been kept. So this is completely erratic. This is completely random when people promise something. But my hunch would be, with the growth in the amount of data and the improving quality of such models, that things could change. An observation over the last 4 years I had in the German parliament that the Grand Coalition, in this case, the government, they had a certain belief in technology without having a closer look how technology is doing things. So there was a belief technology can solve problems in surveillance, for instance, mainly surveillance, without proof that this was effective. A European Court of Justice can pass a decision, or another court, and they can say this is against basic rights, this is not suitable, this is not reasonable. Those are the three questions you have to answer with a yes, if there are limits to your basic rights. But usually those questions are not asked or answered. You don't even know whether the answer is yes or no. And I think there is a certain danger. When you think you can have maximum surveillance, and at the same time you have security gaps in devices, because you can use them to surveillance somebody. But we've all got those devices, even the 99% of people who are not criminals, and the devices can be attacked. So some technology or biometric surveillance that it could solve problems, it turns into vulnerability to ransomware attacks, for instance. It may not matter for your holiday photos, but if there is a ransomware attack on hospitals, that is not funny. The University of Berlin, hospitals, cities had ransomware attacks and successful ransomware attacks. And this is what I would like to cite. And here you see a fundamental problem in politics, namely glaring incompetence in anything digital. You know a bit and think it can solve a problem, then this argument is dangerous. But the side effects, well, that occurs only later, and the side effects are not predicted. And then things happen that are not so good. So somebody wants to ask a question. So today there are no ushers, so please walk over to the mic. Ms. Domscheit-Berg, I've got a question about your previous point, namely AI aided chatbots. That's fascinating, but who designs those systems is the question. As attractive as it may sound at first glance, I think it's a bit of a dystopian vision. The question is, who has the better AI support in a chatbot? This could lead to an arms race, that the other side has a similar system, and then it's like for high-frequency trading. The two systems are competing, and then the systems decide whether something is granted, an application is granted or not. And that would lead to a degree of depoliticization when systems negotiate with each other, compete with each other like two professional attorneys or lawyers fighting with each other. What is your opinion? Answer. I've mentioned a chatbot for filling in forms. It's not that you find a robot on the side of the administration, and then there is another chatbot from the social association, and there is me, but I've only got a chatbot for the form. And it doesn't really matter whether it's the chatbot designed by an administration, but it's not a battle against systems. I've got two chatbots, one from the administration and one from the social association, and it's my decision which one to use, and I may trust the chatbot of the social association more. And the platform plays a role. There are chatbots like that in the US for the application for green cards, and here the Facebook Messenger is used. And I spilled the beans to the Facebook Messenger. It shouldn't be a platform where I have to disclose data which are then misused. For all government applications, we have to make sure that there is ethical security. We have to demand transparency. If it's coming from an administration or social associations, it should be open source, open AI. The algorithms should be open in order to see whether there is a positive interpretation or a narrow interpretation. And there may be applications where it's not useful. There is a debate, for instance, about AI. AI should only be able to decide in favor of an applicant, and not a negative decision. If there were a negative decision, it would be handed over to a human being to make the ultimate decision. This would be one policy of doing it. But there are thoughts about where to use AI in the first place, in the executive, in the administration. You need an aid for decision-making. There are risk category models, one by Professor Katharina Zweig, which has two axes. On one axis is how monopolistic is this situation. So I make an application for social benefits. Well, it's one thing. It's monopolistic. But if it's just about shopping, it's another thing. So do I have alternatives is the one axis. The other axis is how much is the societal damage if the AI decides in the wrong way. And this is a decision for how to sorting a post box. The Federal Office for Immigration has a mailbox where it doesn't really matter if an email is sorted in the wrong way and then manually passed on. If a drone kills a wedding party rather than an enemy, then there is big damage, of course, for society. Here we have to see where are there red lines. If the damage is too high, if I don't have a choice and cannot evade it, couldn't escape it, then it needs to be banned. And there are no ethical red lines like that at the moment. Your example is good in a different aspect as well, because it shows AI applications not necessarily need to be imposed from above or are imposed from above, from the top. Society can have an influence. Which services are provided by AI and what the intentions are. This raises the question, who will get access to data in order to use data and can train data for the use of AI systems. This example about chatbots shows that we can also bank on the creativity of forces in society. This is also a chance, the moderator is saying. And there is another question. Forces in society, that's my cue. The panel is called Depoliticization through Algorithms, Depoliticization of Democracy. But we need politicization of certain fields. I'm at the Weizenbaum Institute, just like Ms. Hofmann. When you work there, you've got the feeling digitization, digital transformation is the #1 topic in Germany, but this is not the case. When you have a look at the public discourse, for instance, in Die Zeit, that newspaper, AI is mentioned when it's about competing against China. Rupert David Precht is writing articles about utopian dreams or dystopic visions or about the knowledge field. What do you think? Where can AI be politicized in such a way that citizens can demonstrate in favor of something, for instance? For instance, climate change. There has to be something that makes people furious or cross so that they become politicized. And the question is, through which issues could you do that? Answer, politicization happens. You could ask, is it politicization or depoliticization when certain algorithms lead to a situation that people don't believe in facts anymore? There is depoliticization because they find confirmation of their bubble, but it politicizes them because they start demonstrating against something. Fridays for Future, for instance, without the social media, used by Greta Thunberg, it wouldn't have become such a massive movement. So there is politicization in this respect. The question is now, as politicians, how can you politicize people? How can you instill that in people? You could use visualization of data, not necessarily based on AI. You could do it at a lower level, where you can bring across information in a better way. And this brings me to your initial argument, namely that you should see to it that politics becomes more verifiable. Those data were used, and for that reason we make this political decision in this way. So more transparency like that could lead to more acceptance of democratic decision if you did it in a smarter way than today. That's an interesting question. How you politicize the use of AI in society, which has become tired as far as knowledge is concerned and skills are concerned. For instance, the debate about COVID, how COVID and corona experts are being seen when they have new data after 2 months and they change their opinion about face masks or the contagiousness of children. And, skills or knowledge is usually based on provisional knowledge. AI systems are expert systems as well. How can you politicize them? I think this is a very sophisticated task. I mainly conduct research into the new media and communication sciences at the moment, and I started thinking about it by thinking about the notion of autonomy, triggered by phenomena like autonomous driving, for instance. I wondered what kind of notion of autonomy is behind it all. And the upshot is it's a very narrow understanding of autonomy. The autonomous car is a car where human beings don't intervene. this is nothing to do with the notion of autonomy in political theory and democracy. Nothing to do with it. Where autonomy is based on a political order which grants autonomy, protects it, limits it. It's based on the use of reason, because autonomy has to be fleshed out in a way which is good for everybody and not just for one individual. Issues like that are being asked, so there is a dazzling array of arguments, and there is a lot of history in this notion of autonomy. But in AI, there is no background like that. This tightrope walk between individual and collective autonomy, what I would wish for, well, politicization. What do I have in mind? Namely, those narrow discourses in AI, which are just about optimization, efficiency, that we flesh it out with what we want to see as society.
That's a fascinating issue, but I think we could go into detail here because AI is usually compared with statistics, but based on evaluating data that show how action and results are interconnected, I wonder whether this society that is tired of facts could be made aware of how important data evaluation is, and we could decrease the notion of people thinking that facts are only about beliefs. And that coincides with something you said. Maybe we have to start again by saying that this is not the ultimate truth. Well, maybe, today we say we will not believe in any statistic unless you have forged it yourself. So what you're saying is very similar to that. And in my opinion, one of our basic principles should be that AI, at least when it's used by governments and states, should only be used for purposes that the AI has been trained for. There are some countries where we see that states, governments did not commit to that. For example, in the United States, when an AI was trained for the resocialization of criminals, it was used for making a decision or a judgment about how long the prison sentences were going to be. So the purpose was entirely different compared to what it was planned to be used for. And then it became apparent that the AI estimated that people would reoffend faster or more likely than they actually did. And I think the example of the young student in the UK is also a way of politicization. His personal drive was that he wanted to grant people access to their legal entitlements and to disconnect it from the fact whether people could afford paying a lawyer. And he's been doing that for some years. He wanted to find an intelligent solution that decreases the barrier that people are facing when it comes to claiming these rights. And that's the reason why I keep telling this story, because I hope that some computer scientists hear this story and then decide to develop chatbots of their own, because I think it's a really great cause. There's a question from the audience, not an audience, but rather a comment. What I'm hearing is that you differentiate between data and meaning. For example, in case of autonomous driving, we know that the environment is being evaluated, and based on that, certain decisions are made, but there is no meaning behind that. In contrast to that, if I take to the streets in order to protest something, then I'm doing that because I'm enthusiastic about something and I need a meaning behind that, a reason why I'm trying to support that or protest something. Well, I don't know if there's data that is free of meaning, because I think any kind of data evaluation is linked to attaching a meaning to the data. And that's why I do not agree with your way of thinking. We have to be aware of the fact that a meaning could be attached to the data that could even contradict other meanings. Can you explain that, please? Sure. The data we analyze and that we use for making our decisions, for example, the resocialization capability of criminals, all these things are linked to meaning. So these are meaningful decisions. When we talk about politicization, people usually focus on data-based decisions being biased, for example, because they reproduce inequalities, social inequalities that are already exist in our society. So that is a reproduction of meaning. And we know that AI-supported systems that evaluate job applications are not impartial as well. And that brings us to pseudo-objectivity, because I remember in the past we thought that AI was able to make impartial decisions compared to a biased manager, but then we realized that it wasn't able to do that because it's based on real-world data. Despite everything, the hopes were high. I remember that. And there were advocates that really tried to propagate that. But what's so absurd about this debate is that judges have higher expectations towards objective decisions than we had in the past. The application and use of AI has established new benchmarks, higher benchmarks. I realized that when I read about a study that evaluated judgments in France. I know that was part of the feature section in different newspapers. And this was about judgments being less strict if they were made after the lunch break. And that led to the fact that that was actually banned in France. Why? Because it changed the way we regarded the ability of judges to make an unbiased decision. And that illustrates that this way of data analysis really sets the benchmark higher than we encountered in the past, and we weren't able to do that in the past because we weren't familiar with these kinds of systems. There's another thing I would like to mention. May I interrupt? I think we still have 2 questions from the audience, and maybe they're linked to the issues we've already raised. My question regards the objectivity of AI. That's perfect. Thank you. What I would like to know is, how can you guarantee that an AI that is to support the political decision-making process is based on suitable data that are suitable for providing an impartial judgment? That is a major challenge because it is linked to how we can analyze the quality of data. And I think everyone knows that when we deal with big data sets, for example, when it comes to data brokers that gather data and generate new data sets in order to sell them, that they use data of questionable quality. So no one knows how to make sure that the quality is high over the long term, because data that is being evaluated at the moment is analyzed by private companies, and that's why we know that quality isn't that high. I have the feeling that we have just started this process of making sure that big data sets have a high quality, and that is linked to the question of who has access to this kind of data. And we know that the data do not belong to certain companies, so we have to ask ourselves, with whom do we share them and where do we have to disclose them? So we're still at the very beginning of this process, and I'm excited to find out how this will develop in future. Well, there are interesting studies on data that are being disclosed to public and used by society. For example, when it comes to data that's collected, for example, on how we behave in traffic. Why should they belong to smartphone companies and not to everyone? I'm not talking about personal data, but anonymous data. When, for example, we know that from 8 to 8:30, we know this and that many people are on the streets, and then we could analyze that in order to improve public transport. Because we are talking about autonomous decisions, but there's this final decision. AI-supported systems say the probability of this person being a terrorist is about 90%. And then the question is, how autonomously can I act as a soldier when this is about shooting somebody or not, when the AI-supported system gives me this probability, but I decide not to go with that decision, but to make my own decision, because my gut feeling tells me that this is not a terrorist, but rather a journalist holding a camera and not a machine gun. So that is a very critical decision, and I would say more than 80% of the people would not even dare contradict the AI-supported decision. So we need research on that. Would you rather trust your gut feeling if the probability was higher than 51%? So I know that some researchers have already looked into that and say that your decisions are not autonomous or free if you have the support of an AI system, because you know the recommendation of the AI is such and you think it's trustworthy, so you go with that decision. But it seems the longer you do that job, for example, this soldier pressing the button or someone else pressing a button that says the drone will kill somebody, are more likely to trust the AI over a longer period of time. So I think much more research is required here. And unless we have that, we need to regulate that. And that is true for autonomous and semi-autonomous weapon system. And that shows that this really is even an excuse. Well, I think it depends on the context. I'm thinking about the application of the Compass software in the United States. Judges were asked about the extent to which they would recommend this software and use the recommendations of the software. And a study revealed that the recommendations appeared at the very end of the file, and many judges did not even look at the last pages because they did not trust the AI and rather relied on their own judgment. So I believe that this is perhaps linked to the confidence level, maybe their experience and what they think about these AI-supported softwares. And the scenario you painted, I guess that time pressure really does play a major role in a different hierarchy, certainly. At court, the judge is the highest person in the hierarchy and has a higher confidence, but a soldier in return is in a different hierarchy and they really have to make a fast decision based on a recommendation, a recommended command. Yes, you're right, context does matter. In which context, in which situation, which role, and that makes it even more complicated to evaluate these systems, or a diagnostic system for different types of cancer. We already know that a data set contains much more cases than one human doctor has seen in his or her entire life. And that is why such a diagnostic AI system is perhaps more experienced than a human being. So it does depend on the context. What we do know is that time is running out, but I would like to have 2 more questions from the audience. Maybe you could ask your questions consecutively, and I hope that we can answer them. And I see we have 1 question from the virtual audience, so maybe we can hear all 3 questions. Thank you very much. Future prospects. What will we do? A critical question. What will we do if an AI system is more correct when it comes to re-socialization probabilities than we anti-racists would have it? For example, that it does depend on the background of these criminals and that they have a poorer background and that they are more likely to re-offend. I know there was a study called The Cost of Fairness. Maybe you can comment on that, but first let's hear the 2 other questions. This is not a question, but rather a thought of mine. AI and ethics, trust in AI. We talked about politicization. A positive scenario would be a public debate in society about things that matter to us on an ethical level. What are ethical principles that we want to use for data collection, and maybe we can derive basic principles for future data collection systems to integrate some moral principles for AI-based learning. But that, of course, is something that needs to be developed by society as a whole. And I believe there is no common consensus at the moment. Thank you very much. And that is the beautiful thing about these debates, that we are forced to think about such questions. And AI really leads to the fact that we as society need to renegotiate certain issues. And let's hear the last question. Roughly speaking, I would like to add something. Depoliticization is something that I do not really see here, because in terms of norms, we need to know what kind of AI are we aiming at, and that is a very broad political debate that is overdue. So the question is how to kickstart this public debate. What could we do specifically in the Bundestag, in politics, in order to make progress here and talk about the ethics in AI? Well, we have the Data Ethics Committee and the Enquete Committee on AI. These 2 bodies really have already published different recommendations for the public discourse. What I really appreciated was Ms. Baas, who introduced herself in the political party, the left, that she suggested to establish a transparent parliament that will make it possible for the citizens to have more insights into the political process. And she actually suggested different formats, also online events. And in my opinion, that would be a perfect way of trying to talk with different citizens about AI together with experts and their input in order to find out what important ethical values we can define. Jeanette, I can only second that. Phases of automation are phases where things cannot be taken for granted. So these are moments where we have to renegotiate, and we need to really define important values again. With digitalization, we realize that questions like what is a car, what is a patent, have reappeared on our agenda. So we are responsible for making sure that these important questions are not answered by small or narrow committees, but rather by a public debate. And I'm sure that we'll be able to do that when it comes to AI. Thank you very much. I think there's one more question regarding digital principles. What happens if an AI-based system is right when it comes to the probability of somebody being a reoffender? But that wasn't really what it was all about. They were asked, for example, did you have a relative that was an offender? And that is not legitimate. Why does it matter if one of your relatives is a criminal? Even if there was a relation, this should not come into play when you as an individual are being assessed. So I think that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Why do we have rich people living in villas consuming cocaine and they never end up in jail, but poor people hanging out in the park? The park is being supervised and patrolled through by police officers, but these rich people aren't, because people just don't assume that they are criminals and they just don't look. They close their eyes. I've had a very similar question. An answer of mine is to the question, what if the AI is right and black people are more likely to reoffend? Well, we know that the color of your skin is not the reason why you become an offender or not, but the responsibility of an AI would rather be to understand the correlations. For example, if black people had been sent to jail for no reason in the past. So what is the reason? Why do people become offenders in the first place? That is rather something we should focus on. And AI really forces us to rethink the interrelations between different social groups, and I'm thankful for that and for the fact that there are so many things that we still need to talk about, and we really shouldn't stop the discussion by saying AI is objective and unbiased, but rather keep on talking and negotiating. Although we're running out of time, I think we will have numerous opportunities for discussing these interesting things again. At 5 o'clock, we will talk about tech platforms in times of digital capitalism. I hope you enjoy this conference, have many interesting debates in your breaks, and thank you very much to our two panelists.